Hi everyone, and welcome to Noona's Noonchi, where I do a deep dive into some of our favorite K-dramas from a mental health perspective. My name. It was good to see So-hee in this badass role, right? Compared to how she was in Nevertheless, which shows her range of acting, which I really liked, but I didn't get to finish Nevertheless. But I did get through My Name, which is so not my normal genre, but my husband saw it first, liked it, and I wanted to see the appeal. I like to watch quality K-dramas despite the fact that it's not my genre. What I liked about My Name is it does a good job of showing the grief cycle. We've been talking a lot about grief and healing, and in the past couple lives that I've done is all about that, and I outline how to claim or what it looks like to claim your grief. Well, the entire K-drama of My Name is about this girl's grief. And you see her going through all of it. It's not just hers. I mean, her police partner also shows a lot of that grief, but you get to see all the emotions in the grief cycle in this K-drama. And so I wanted to point that out. If you wanted to watch it for that sake, just to see what grief looked like in a different way. Remember, grief is multidimensional. It doesn't look one way, and it's a cycle. And you see her experience all of these emotions, these stages, literally going through the whole K-drama all at once. It wasn't like, here's the first stage. And regardless of popular disbelief, I haven't seen really someone go through all those stages in order, not necessarily. And then you could be going in order. You might be in acceptance where you're good about something that happened and you feel like that you have dealt with that grief effectively, and then something else happens to trigger you and get you back into another stage. I feel like that's all normal and part of our emotions. But Han-so-hee's character, literally, just as you can recall, and this is not a spoiler, gives up her whole identity, her actual name, her being, to figure out and avenge her father's murderer. And that whole is what drives her, right? So let's start with shock. Let's just go in order, even though it's not in the order of what you see, and understand how this girl has learned to claim her grief. And that's what you see at the end. And yes, it does happen at the end of the K-drama, and I'm going to do my best not to reveal any spoilers. I'm not exactly condoning how she was going through her grief, right? And doing my best not to go through all that, but yes, getting involved with being this undercover, right, working for the police, but also being a spy for the drug ring, and that was what her father was involved with. So she decided to go back into that life to figure things out. And let's start with the initial grief. There was initial grief is not just the loss of her father, which is what drove everything in the K-drama, the loss of the experience she had with her father before he died. Grief can look very multidimensional, where she was missing her father and the life they had, right? Because he had disappeared several months prior and she was angry about that. So she was already grieving the loss of her dad, the presence of her dad, the relationship she had. You saw her being bullied. Episode 1 was very gripping, did a great job of setting up the story. But the whole point was you saw a different type of grief. And that grief cycle was she missed her father, but her father wasn't dead. He was still very much alive, but not present. And that was her grief there. So she was already dealing with that. And then, yes, I mean, people know this is not a spoiler. And then she actually witnesses her father's murder right in front of her. And then that grief shifts to the fact of her father was killed, right? She was already grieving, not having that relationship and missing him and what they had. And he went into this life that she couldn't understand and really didn't know about. And then he's murdered, and then she goes off, and that's what the K-drama is about, and really trying to avenge that. Now, let's be clear, I'm not condoning you going out for revenge and becoming this killer or fighter. No, that's not what I'm condoning, but I'm wanting to understand the depth of her despair and her grief, and going through the shock, disbelief, denial, anger bargaining, and then depression, testing, and acceptance. I will share in this K-drama, I wasn't sure that I really saw testing, which is figuring out realistic solutions. This is a newer stage that was adapted into the original model of grief, but I agree with it because I see it. But I didn't really see it here because I don't think a lot of the solutions were realistic, though she thought they were. You know, working for the police, spying on them for the drug lords, basically working with the drug lords, right, or the drug ring, because that's what her father did, or so she thought. I'm not going to release any spoilers. But a lot of the culmination comes in episode 6 toward the latter half. Oh my gosh, I thought her acting was really good. People think of this acceptance as a peace. Not always. So I wanted to point this out. Sometimes the acceptance comes in such despair and almost like anguish. Ooh, that's it. You see her anguish of accepting a realization. Okay, not releasing any spoilers, sorry to be vague, because I want you to see it if you're able to get through it, because it's a great K-drama. And she accepts what she finds out. And then her grief cycle takes another turn toward the last two episodes, 7 and 8, and how she addresses that grief, if that makes sense, because she gets some information. Actually, I was floored. It surprised me a lot. I mean, a lot of twists and turns and some jumps and some like, oh my gosh, did that happen? So there was a lot of that. But the grief is, yeah, the initial shock of seeing her father killed in front of her, right? And then the initial shock of finding out a lot of things. Okay, there's a lot of that going on throughout. It's not just one-time shock, by the way. The grief cycle is continual. Okay, shock is part of that. The denial, I want to say, guess what? I believe she was in denial the entire K-drama. Denial of not the fact that her father died, but the denial of the fact that whatever he was doing, his life was not in vain. She wanted to figure that out. So the denial was not letting him go, right? Because I mean, it's difficult, especially when we're talking murder, horrific crime. I can't imagine what people are going through when their loved ones have been murdered. And yes, there's always that longing of knowing why and what and the motive, right? And that's super important for people to get those consequences of committing such an act. But for her case, that denial kept going throughout, where perhaps she was in denial of what her father was doing with the drug ring, right? The denial that her father was actually involved, because you could see glimpses. He was a good father. He was a great father. Seemed like they had a really loving relationship, single dad, but she was in denial of why he was doing that in the first place. She even lashes out at him, right? And there's a regret in that later on after he dies. But I see denial throughout the whole thing. So I wanted to point that out to you, that denial is not a one-time thing. Oh, seeking in vain. No, it was literally throughout the whole thing of pockets of information she was getting through this, through her experiences and what she was doing. Try not to do the spoilers. And then denying it, and then realizing it, denying it again, and realizing it. Does that make sense? To try to piece together information. That was her whole thing. She was going to get to the bottom of who killed her dad, right? And she saw the killer. I mean, not the face, but what the person was with the black hoodie. And then we have the anger, which was definitely, you see that. That's usually more obvious because you can express that more, but her anger was throughout it. And that's what drove her to actually, learn how to fight and do everything. And the grit that she had, by the way, she already had the grit, because when she was fighting those school bullies, she already had it. She just had to learn how to hone it in and learn those skills to fight, right? And then go through the police academy. That was 5 years of her life of dealing with that grief cycle. And then we have what I think is interesting, after that anger, right? And then you know how we see her depression? You know where you see that depression is actually also throughout the whole K-drama. People think of depression, again, you see glimpses of sadness, or it's just sorrow. Her sorrow and sadness was shown through that anger and the fight that she had to figure out who killed her dad. Her depression was also the entire time. And that's how also grief can work. That's why grief is so difficult to study and work with, and so hard to explain to people, and even to myself that has experienced grief, right? And then the testing, as I said, I didn't really see much of that. Seeking realistic solutions. So she thought they were realistic, but to me, they weren't quite realistic. Maybe realistic would have been, the go through grief counseling. Yes, but this is a drama, so I'm just going to be real. But to her, those were realistic. Trying to go undercover, investigate, figure out, work with this drug king, right? Who claimed to be her father's best friend, or basically her father was the second kingpin, right? Really close to this guy. And she believed all that in her grief. Now, he had taken advantage of that grief. I'm not going to share anything, but the grief was also taken advantage of, and you can be taken advantage of in your grief because you're so vulnerable to believe what you want to believe. Again, denial that something happened or it was in vain. So you're not seeing things clearly because you're going through so many emotions, right? So all these 7 stages of grief, and then the acceptance. Again, episode 6 is where I see that true acceptance, but it does not look like, It's actually there where that anguish comes in, and that she's able to accept what's happened and really be a little clear-headed, believe it or not. Now, at the very end, I believe it ends well, wraps things nicely, as K-dramas do. But that acceptance, even though people think, the acceptance was at the end, no, it came at the end of episode 6. So I wanted to point that out. Again, literally when she was wailing, that was the acceptance. So interestingly enough, that grief cycle is throughout the whole thing. Again, constant shock might have been in the beginning, and then shock came again when she found out some news, Shock comes around 3 times, okay? And then the denial is throughout, right? And then we have the anger. Oh, you see that throughout. You see that evidently. Bargaining, and she's bargaining on both sides, police and drugs, the drug lords, or the drug circle, the drug pins, or what do you call them? Drug rings, sorry. So she's constantly bargaining, figuring out who did what to my dad? What's going on? What are the answers I never knew about my dad's life? She really didn't know about it, but she still loved him, right? Then you have that depression come through and that angst of, oh my gosh, that whole time she is sad. You can see it. By the way, sadness and depression is also a grouchiness. It's like a negative Nancy, Debbie Downer. It's not just sorrow and weeping. There's depression that you could see. Grouchy people, angry people are also depressed. And then testing, not so much, and then acceptance. So hopefully I'm not forgetting any of the stages, but there's 7, and they'll outline here in this deep dive. But I want you to take a look at that to understand grief a little bit differently. Not in the outlook of people thinking of it one way, where it's always about sadness and everything, and that anger. But there's all of those stages in the grief cycle for Han So-hee's character. And again, to even give up her name is part of that grief cycle. The denial of who she is to get to the bottom of what she wants. To figure out who killed her dad. So brief look at that, but that's a deep dive into my name. That's the overall message for me that I wanted to share, and for you to look at that grief cycle to understand a little bit deeper of what that might look like for you, and also validate the perplexity of those emotions and complexity and gravity of the emotions that you may be feeling when you're dealing with grief. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, Noona's Noonchi, and hit the bell button to get notified of new episodes to come.